Kara Shalom, welcome to our watercolor journey. Working on hot pressed paper can prove to be quite challenging. Let's see how Heinrich managed it. The materials used are listed in the description below. On the palette, we have light red, New Cambodge, quinacridone violet, Prussian blue, a grey-green mix of light red and Prussian blue, raw sienna, a green premix of New Cambodge and Prussian blue, and a bit of white gouache for the highlights. Color alternatives are listed below. The Canson Heritage hot pressed paper is taped to a flat board. The board is at a very slight angle to help the paint flow. Heinrich wets the entire paper with a Princeton 1-inch mop and then uses the silver black velvet number 12 round to add raw sienna to the sky. When adding the blue, the raw sienna won't turn green. He follows that with some Prussian blue at the top of the picture plane, which he then diffuses towards the horizon. The paper is very wet, so the paint will flow and blend nicely. He adds a bit of the grey-green mix from the palette to draw in the darker clouds. He then picks up some of the brighter green, which he mixed from New Cambodge and Prussian blue to start the tree line on the left. More New Cambodge produces a brighter green, and more Prussian blue will give you a darker green. He adds the green wet into wet and allows it to flow freely. He adds a bit of light red to bring variation. Here he uses the Rubens No. 0 fan brush to pull out some of the paint to the sides and to add a few patches of the darker green for shadows. The paint flows easily, so Heinrich halts the flow with a bit of Prussian blue to create the lake area. He adds a few strokes of the grey mix for variation. He uses the greens and some New Cambodge for the foreground. To allow himself to have a basis to create texture in the foreground, he adds a bit more pigment in a variety of colors from the palette. He uses a cut-up store card to score some grasses in the foreground. The paint is still very wet, so it pulls into the scoring to create dark lines. Heinrich uses the card to create rocks, but the paint is still too wet and the surface too smooth, so the paint simply flows back into place. In order to help him with some interest and variety in the foreground, he uses some salt, which he sprinkles lightly into the wet paint. While he waits for the salt to work, he uses the card to score some lines in the tree line on the left. The paint has settled a bit here, so when he uses the card, it pushes the paint to the sides, which exposes the white of the paper to create highlights. Allow the painting to dry thoroughly. Don't rely on touching it to feel for dryness. The surface might feel dry, but there might still be moisture trapped inside the paper. Use a hairdryer or leave it for a while to give it enough time to dry. The salt has created beautiful texture in the foreground, which Heinrich will use to his advantage later on. To emphasize the horizon line, he uses the green mix and Prussian blue. Then he softens the lines with a bit of water. Here he adds a bit of raw sienna to show the reflection of the light in the sky. He uses the fan brush and some stronger pigment to add texture to the tree line on the left. He also adds a darker green to the base of the outcropping on the left and to the immediate foreground to create shadows. He uses the patterns created by the salt to guide him when he adds some quinacridone violet to the foreground. While he's working on this, the paint starts to spread into the sea area. He tries to hold the spread with a paper towel. He uses the smaller silver black velvet and Prussian blue to add a few ripples into the water in the foreground. He enhances the color in the foreground with a few more dots of quinacridone violet. Hot pressed paper reacts very differently to cold pressed paper. If you want soft fluid lines, you need to wet the paper thoroughly, as the paper tends to easily create hard lines. The paper has no tooth or surface texture, which also allows for a soft, dreamy washes. The brush effortlessly glides over the paper because of the smooth texture. If you want to add texture to your painting, you have to use different methods to create the texture, like using a variety of brush strokes, adding salt, or scoring, for example. However, scoring isn't always effective. The paper tends to dry on the surface, but it keeps the moisture longer inside the page. This can cause a bit of a mess if you don't allow the paper to dry thoroughly before you paint your next layers. Overall, this is a beautiful paper to work with, but it takes some practice. This paper is ideal for detail work like botanicals or more realistic images. He adds a few more lines and dots for added texture and variety. To add a bit of light, he uses a Chinese calligraphy brush and white gouache. The scoring lines in the background did not give enough light, so Heinrich also adds a bit of gouache here to bring back the light. The hot-pressed paper allowed Heinrich to create a soft, dreamy atmosphere in his painting. The paper was not without its challenges, but in general it worked well and produced acceptable results. Please let us know in the comments what your thoughts are about hot-pressed paper. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to see you soon. Vaya con Dios.